You know, when we think about the American Revolution, we usually get this picture of patriots fighting for liberty against the British crown. But what if I told you that for tens of thousands of enslaved African Americans, the word liberty meant something totally different? Their fight for freedom wasn't just about a distant king, it was about their own lives, right then and there. And the choice they made, well, it might just surprise you. So let's just start with this question. Put yourself in their shoes for a second. If you were enslaved in 1776, who would you have fought for? This wasn't some simple choice between being a patriot or a loyalist. It was a choice between two sides, both deeply tangled up in the institution of slavery, and each one offering a very different and very uncertain path to freedom. And when you look at the numbers, the answer history gives us is, honestly, it's staggering. An estimated 20,000 black men sided with the British, and on the American side, only about 9,000. So more than twice as many chose to fight for the crown. That one fact kind of flips the whole script on what we think we know about the revolution. So, the big question is, why? Okay, to really get this, we have to look at what the British were putting on the table. For thousands of enslaved people, the British Army didn't look like tyranny at all. Actually, it looked like the most direct, most real promise of freedom they had ever heard in their entire lives. And it all really kicked off with this one document, Lord Dunmore's Proclamation. Now, let's be totally clear here. This was not some big moral awakening for the British. Nope, this was a cold, calculated military strategy. They needed to mess with the rebellion and get more soldiers. And they figured out the quickest way to do that was to turn the Patriots' own system of forced labor right back against them. I mean, just listen to those words from back in 1775. If you were living in bondage, hearing that would have been absolutely world-changing. This was, for all intents and purposes, the first mass emancipation proclamation on American soil, almost 100 years before Lincoln. It was a straight-up deal, fight for us and you will be free. And this wasn't just talk, it had immediate, real-world effects. The British actually formed Lord Dunmore's Ethiopian Regiment. And get this, their soldiers wore uniforms with the words "Liberty to Slaves" stitched right onto them. A few years later, the Philipsburg Proclamation expanded the offer even more. All of this set off a massive wave of people escaping to the British lines. We're talking an estimated 100,000 people who risked everything for that chance at freedom. So what about the 9,000 who sided with the Americans? Well, for them, the path was way murkier. Choosing the Patriots wasn't a sure thing at all. It was a huge gamble, a bet that the lofty ideals of liberty that all these slaveholders were talking about would, someday, actually apply to them too. And this slide just lays out the central hypocrisy perfectly. At first, the Continental Army officially banned black soldiers from joining up. Why? Because of a deep-seated fear that if they armed enslaved people, it would lead to massive rebellions. But, war has a way of changing things. As the fighting dragged on, George Washington himself realized that the winner would be whoever could arm black men the fastest. It was a choice made out of pure necessity, not idealism. But even with all that hypocrisy, thousands of black men fought and fought bravely for the Patriot cause. You have Crispus Attucks, who was the very first person to die for the Revolution at the Boston Massacre. Heroes like Peter Salem, who fought at Bunker Hill. There was the famous 1st Rhode Island Regiment, which was mostly black soldiers. And then you have someone like James Armistead Lafayette, an enslaved man who pretended to be a runaway, spied on the British, and gave the Americans the critical intel they needed to win the entire war at Yorktown. Now, just let this number sink in for a second. 4.5 years. That was the average length of service for a black soldier. That is 8 times longer than the average for a white soldier. They weren't just showing up. Their constant, long-term presence was a huge part of what kept the Continental Army going. And that commitment was absolutely essential to winning. At the final decisive battle of the war, the Siege of Yorktown, a German officer fighting with the Americans estimated that about a quarter, 1 out of every 4 soldiers in the American Army, was black. Just think about that. An incredible contribution, right at the moment that mattered most. Okay, so the war ends, America wins its independence, huzzah, right? But what happened to the thousands of black soldiers who fought? On both sides? Well, the end of the revolution led to 2 very, very different outcomes, and neither one was simple. For the black loyalists, the British actually did keep their promise, for the most part. When their ships left places like New York, they carefully wrote down over 3,000 names in a ledger called the Book of Negroes to make sure they got safe passage to freedom. Most of them ended up in Nova Scotia. But as you can see here, freedom didn't mean equality. They faced terrible conditions and discrimination, so many of them made another journey, all the way across the Atlantic to help found Freetown in Sierra Leone. Their search for a real home didn't end with the war. And this table just lays it all out, side by side. It's so stark. For the Black loyalists, the outcome was freedom, but it came with exile. For the Black patriots who stayed, for so many the outcome was just betrayal. Men who had been promised their freedom were forced right back into slavery. And then, the final insult, in 1792 the new United States Congress officially banned Black men from serving in the military they had just helped create. The words of James Roberts, a veteran who fought for the Patriots, just capture the heartbreak of it all. But instead of freedom, I was soon after my return sold, separated from my wife and children. He risked his life for the idea of a free country, and that same country turned around and sold him. It's just a devastating, personal story of a promise completely broken. So after all this, what's the takeaway? I think it's that the story of America's founding isn't just one simple tale of liberty for all. It's way more complicated, way more messy, and often way more contradictory than that, especially when you look at it through the eyes of African Americans. At the end of the day, the American Revolution was really two wars happening at the same time. For white colonists, it was a fight for independence from Britain. But for thousands of enslaved Black people, it was a fight for personal freedom. And they had to decide which side gave them a better shot. It was a choice between a gamble on American ideals versus a direct promise from the king. And looking at this history shows us so much. First, it shows us that African Americans weren't just passive bystanders, they were making strategic choices to shape their own futures. Second, it just screams the central paradox of the whole revolution, a nation fighting for freedom while literally built on slavery. And finally, it forces us to face a difficult truth. At that moment in history, the British monarchy offered a clearer, more direct path to freedom for enslaved people than the new American Republic did. Which leaves us with one last big question to think about. How does it change our understanding of America's founding to know that for thousands of Black Americans, the fight for their liberty meant fighting against the American Revolution? It's a question that makes the past more complex, for sure, but in doing that, it gives us a much, much truer picture of what America was and what it was struggling to become.